Greetings to my dear guests on this video. I wish you a pleasant viewing and look forward to your feedback in the comments. I never expected to become indispensable, at least not in a way that anyone would notice. My name is Lisa, and I've worked at Harkwell International for almost 6 years. My title? International Communications Analyst. Sounds fancy, right? But to most people in the office, I was just the quiet girl buried in a mountain of paperwork, always typing away, always translating, always too busy to chat in the break room. But what they didn't know was that I was the only one who spoke fluent Maltese. I didn't advertise it. Why would I? It was just one of 5 languages I knew: French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Maltese. The last one came from my grandmother, who raised me on stories of Gozo and church bells and summers by the sea. I loved the language. And now, all these years later, it was finally proving to be useful. Harkwell was expanding. We had just announced the opening of a new European hub, right in the heart of Valletta, Malta. This meant I was swamped. Documents, contracts, cultural briefing decks, onboarding scripts for the Malta team, translation verifications. I barely had time to breathe, let alone attend every meeting on my calendar. But I was excited. Really. It was the kind of work that made me feel alive, useful. That Thursday morning, I had just sat down with my second coffee when the internal chat pinged. All hands meeting, 15 minutes, conference room A mandatory. I frowned. No subject line, no agenda, just the kind of vague, panic-inducing message that screamed disruption. But I had 3 reports due by noon, and our Maltese legal advisor had just sent over a batch of notes that needed translating before the next round of contract reviews. So I replied, "Can't make it. Tied up with Malta launch prep. We'll review notes later." Hit send. Took a sip. Kept typing. If only I knew what I had just missed. If only I knew that this single decision, to skip one mysterious meeting, would change everything. 20 minutes later, as I was finishing my email to our procurement lead, I saw the first wave of confusion pass through the floor. A few people walked past my desk, whispering. Someone from HR rushed into the conference room. Then someone else came out with eyes wide, clutching a stapler like it was a lifeline. I ignored it. Office drama was like weather. Loud, inconvenient, but usually harmless. At 11:07 a.m., my direct supervisor popped her head into my cubicle. "Lisa," she said, trying to smile, "can I see you in conference room A for a moment?" I blinked. "Now? I'm in the middle of the translation batch for the Maltese team. If it doesn't go out today..." "It'll only take a minute," she said, and her eyes looked off, like she was trying very hard not to say something. I should have known then, should have seen it coming. But I didn't. I followed her and walked right into the storm. The walk down the corridor felt longer than usual. My supervisor, Emma, walked a step ahead, her mouth set in a straight line, not offering any clues about what I was walking into. When she opened the door to conference room A, it was like walking into a different world. Everyone was standing. That in itself was strange. Our all-hands meetings rarely included standing ovations, or tension you could slice through with a paperclip. At the front of the room stood Mr. Hastings, our company's longtime CEO, with a tight smile and a posture that screamed announcement. Beside him was a tall man in a tailored navy suit, arms crossed, eyes already scanning the crowd like he was sizing us up. His hair was neatly styled, his jaw sharp, and his expression unreadable. But his vibe? Aggressive. Cold. "Everyone, thank you for gathering," Mr. Hastings began. "I won't keep you long. I'd like you all to meet Max Brenner. Starting today, Max will be stepping in as the new Chief Executive Officer of Harkwell International." There was a beat of silence, then a smattering of polite claps. Max nodded curtly, not smiling, not even pretending. "I'll let him speak in a moment," Hastings continued, "but I want to thank each of you for your work, especially during this critical time with our Malta expansion. Change can be challenging, but I trust that with Max's leadership, we'll move into this next phase stronger than ever." I stared at the floor for a second, my heart sinking. CEO? A replacement? Hastings hadn't even hinted he was leaving. The Malta operation was in its most delicate phase. We couldn't afford a transition right now. And then Max spoke. He stepped forward with an almost theatrical grace, hands clasped behind his back. "Thank you, Mr. Hastings," he said smoothly. "I'm honored to step into this role. And let me be clear, this company has enormous potential, but potential means nothing without performance. Over the coming weeks, I'll be evaluating each department, every team, and yes, every individual. My goal is to identify what's working and eliminate what isn't." He let that last sentence hang in the air like a guillotine blade. When he was done, Mr. Hastings gave a few final words, then left the room, leaving Max alone with us. And that's when the real temperature dropped. His eyes landed on me. "You must be Lisa," he said. His voice was cool, almost amused. "Our translator turned scheduler turned report writer, the woman who was too busy to attend a mandatory meeting this morning." I stiffened, pulse suddenly in my throat. "I'm in charge of the Malta launch documentation. Legal frameworks had to be reviewed." He raised a hand, cutting me off. "I read your file. Thorough, detail-oriented, quiet." His lips twitched. "Also, habitually absent from leadership initiatives, unwilling to participate in collaborative restructuring." That was absurd. I didn't even know what the meeting was about when I skipped it. But I held my tongue. Max stepped closer, his tone dropping. "You walk around here like you're wearing a crown, Lisa. Like your work is so precious it can't be interrupted. Like you're too important to sit with the rest of us and listen." My breath hitched. "I don't need someone I have to drag into a room by the hand," he said. "I need people who want to be here." Around us, the room had gone dead silent. He looked me up and down, and then turned away without waiting for a response. The meeting dispersed a few minutes later, but I barely noticed. His words clanged in my chest like church bells. He didn't know. He truly didn't understand what I did. How crucial I was to the Malta branch. How none of this, none of it, could move forward without someone who could speak the language, negotiate the cultural nuance, interpret the subtleties. I wasn't wearing a crown, but I was holding the keys. And he'd just slammed the door without realizing who had them in her pocket. The hallway outside the conference room felt colder than it had on the way in. Not physically, psychologically. Like I'd crossed a threshold into unfamiliar territory. The meeting with Max had been short, pointed, and humiliating in a way that was almost surgical. I walked back to my desk trying to appear unaffected, but inside, my mind was already racing. This wasn't going to be easy. The quiet support I'd built over the past 6 years, my niche, my reliability, my value, meant nothing to Max. To him, I was an obstacle to efficiency. A slow cog in a machine he wanted to rebuild from scratch. It was clear from the way he had looked at me, not as a peer, not even as a subordinate, but as a box to be ticked off and eventually erased. By the following morning, the shift in atmosphere was unmistakable. Max had started making rounds with department heads, speaking with loud confidence, and that thin, corporate charisma of a man who believed words could substitute for wisdom. He was already positioning himself at the center of the Malta expansion project. "I've done this before," I heard him say in the kitchen, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Handled multi-region expansions across Europe and Southeast Asia. Malta's a small fry in comparison. I'll take direct oversight. Clean up the process. No more scattered efforts." He didn't mention me by name. He didn't have to. His tone said it all. By noon, I received a curt email. "Please forward all Malta-related files to my office. Max." No greeting, no thank you. I complied. I gathered the documents, the timelines, the sensitive communications from our legal team in Valletta, the onboarding guidelines I'd customized based on cultural norms, the translation drafts, the policy adaptation notes. I sent it all without a comment. 30 minutes later, I received a forwarded version of my own summary, marked up with bright red comments. Most were superficial changes, terminology preferences, restructuring bullet points, questioning formatting. But a few showed just how far removed Max was from the reality of what we were doing. "Use standard HR templates," one note read, completely disregarding the localization we'd worked hard on for Maltese labor laws. "Avoid translating directly, keep all English versions for consistency." Another error. Our partners in Malta expected native communication. Fluency wasn't a courtesy, it was respect. I read each note, absorbed them in silence, and said nothing. Later that day, Max gathered a few senior managers for what he called a Malta launch reassessment. I was invited, but I may as well have been invisible. He stood at the head of the conference table, radiating self-importance. "Lisa's done a fine job so far," he said, like it was a concession. "But I've had more experience with these kinds of rollouts. We'll be simplifying the communication side, centralizing everything through my office moving forward." Some of the managers glanced at me. A few looked uncomfortable. No one spoke. I nodded slightly, just enough to acknowledge what had been said, not enough to agree, because I knew what Max didn't. Malta wasn't just a line on a map. It was a country with a layered identity, a complex relationship with language, tradition, and diplomacy. The contracts we were drafting weren't boilerplate. They were tailored, precise, reflective of trust that had taken months to build, and would collapse the moment our partners sensed they weren't being heard. Max didn't speak the language. He didn't know that when our lead negotiator in Valletta signed off his emails with Saha, it meant more than goodbye. It meant a wish for health, for well-being, a signal of rapport. He didn't know that our legal partner preferred calls on Tuesdays because Monday meetings clashed with his village's feast day. He didn't know that our HR framework depended on certain cultural nuances around holiday bonuses and local ethics clauses. I did, so I let him take his victory lap. Let him feel like he'd swept in and rescued a project that didn't need rescuing. Because I had learned, long ago, that some mistakes need to happen. Some people only understand the value of something after they've thrown it away. And Max was about to learn that lesson the hard way. I kept working, quietly, diligently. It was the only way I knew how to maintain my sanity, as Max continued bulldozing through the Malta project, like a man with something to prove rather than something to build. He was loud in his decisions, confident in his ignorance, and worst of all, he didn't listen. Every morning, I came in early, just like I always had. I sifted through emails from our Maltese partners, noting their questions and concerns. Sometimes they wrote in English, sometimes in Maltese, especially when they needed to express subtleties or frustrations they didn't want misinterpreted. Their trust had taken months to earn, cultivated through late-night calls, thoughtful responses, and culturally attuned feedback. They addressed me as Habiba, which means friend. But Max didn't see any of that. He wasn't interested in continuity or context. To him, the Malta expansion was just another feather for his cap, a line item to conquer. And I? I was just another name on a spreadsheet. The first week after his takeover, I was pushed out of daily stand-up meetings. When I asked for invites, I was told, "We'll loop you in if needed." He began making changes without consulting me, rewriting presentations I had labored over, reassigning responsibilities, messaging our partners with hollow corporate enthusiasm, using phrases that meant nothing in the culture we were working with. The final straw was the welcome email. I had spent a week crafting it, using formal greetings, subtle nods to Maltese customs, and even referencing St. Paul's Day, a beloved holiday. Max stripped it down and rewrote it in 5 minutes. "Dear team," it began. No warmth, no context, just sterile words and bullet points. That was when I knew I had to speak with him. I scheduled a meeting for the next morning. The tone in his response was dismissive. "Sure, 10 minutes max." I walked into his office at 9 o'clock sharp. The space had already been transformed into something cold and performative. Glass, chrome, and soulless artwork. Max sat behind his desk, typing. He didn't look up. "Lisa," he said flatly. "Go ahead." I took a breath. I wanted to talk about the Malta rollout. There are growing concerns from our partners. They're starting to feel disconnected, ignored. The way we're restructuring the communication flow. He held up a hand, his eyes still on the screen. "You've been with the company how long?" 6 years, I answered. "And how many expansions have you led?" "I've supported 3 international offices," I said, keeping my voice steady. "And this is the first where I've been given strategic input, because I speak Maltese, and because our partners explicitly requested me as the liaison." That got his attention. He finally looked up. For a moment, he was quiet. Then his expression twisted into something sharper, crueler. "So you think that makes you special?" he sneered. "That speaking some niche, irrelevant language makes you irreplaceable?" I said nothing. He stood up slowly, walked around the desk, and leaned on it just inches from where I sat. "Lisa, let me be clear. You're unambitious. You're bland, talentless. I don't need people like you clinging to the past and slowing us down. This company is moving forward, with or without you." I stared at him, heart thudding, but not from fear. From clarity. He didn't know. He really didn't know what he'd just done. I rose calmly, gathered the folder I'd brought, and adjusted my blazer. "I see," I said. Then I smiled. Not a dramatic, bitter smile, just quiet, composed. A smile for the man who had no idea what mistake he had just made. "Good luck," I said, and I turned and left without another word. I walked past his assistant, past the frosted glass doors, down the corridor lined with portraits of former executives who probably would have made the same mistake. I passed Emma, who gave me a look of dread as I passed. I didn't stop. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even shake. Because Monday was coming. And with it, a critical meeting between Harkwell International and our Maltese partners. A meeting Max intended to lead, in a language he didn't speak, and the one person who could save him from the fallout had just walked out of the building. The elevator ride down from the top floor felt unusually long. I watched the numbers blink by, each one pulling me further from a chapter I hadn't expected to close. Not like this. Not with a quiet dismissal and a flurry of hollow insults. But life doesn't always give you the ending you expect. Sometimes it hands you something sharper. Cleaner. I stepped out onto the street, the city's noise rushing over me like a tide. People walked past in suits, phones pressed to their ears, sipping coffee with that urgent pace of importance. I stood still for a moment, breathing it all in. It wasn't grief I felt. It wasn't even rage. It was something steadier, a sense of certainty that I hadn't lost something. Max had, because I knew the truth. This wasn't about performance. It wasn't about the Malta project or communication strategy, or even language proficiency. Max didn't like me. That was it. He didn't like the way I worked quietly, without broadcasting every minor success. He didn't like that I had earned respect rather than demanded it. He didn't like that I didn't flinch or scramble when he tried to assert his dominance. And more than anything, he didn't like that I didn't need him. And people like Max? They needed to be needed. But I wasn't angry. No. I was strangely calm. I'd done everything I could. Everything right. I had worked hard. I had built relationships, earned trust, and shown value in ways that couldn't be measured on a spreadsheet. He couldn't see it, but others would. And part of me, deep down, knew something else too. He'd be back. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But one day soon, he'd face a boardroom filled with confused glances and foreign words. He'd sit in front of our Maltese partners and mispronounce key phrases. He'd smile awkwardly when he didn't understand a cultural reference. He'd call for me, maybe not by name, but by need. And I wouldn't be there. Or maybe I would. That part was still unclear. I walked to a nearby cafe and ordered a cappuccino. The barista smiled at me as she handed it over, and I realized how long it had been since someone had looked at me without expectation or judgment. I sat by the window, watching the office tower from across the street. Max thought he'd won, but I hadn't even started playing. The day drifted into late afternoon, and with it came the quiet beginning of something new. Not the kind of beginning that comes with grand gestures or announcements, but the kind that builds slowly, like the scent of rain before a storm. Let him run the company. Let him lead the Malta launch. Let's see how far he gets without understanding a word they're saying. Emma had tried to call, twice that morning, once the night before. I saw her name flash across my screen, but let it ring out. I wasn't avoiding her out of malice. I just needed time. Space. I needed to watch the dust settle before deciding what came next. What I didn't realize was that inside the walls of Harkwell, the absence of one voice was becoming deafening. It started small. In the marketing sync, Jared asked, "Do we have final approval on the Maltese translations for the launch page?" Silence. In the HR prep call, someone asked, "Who's reviewing the onboarding documents for cultural missteps?" Awkward pause. And during the legal touchpoint with our Malta advisors, a well-meaning executive tried to wing it over Zoom and couldn't even pronounce the partner's last name. The call ended early. That afternoon, in a hastily called leadership meeting, the murmurs became concern. She was involved in every detail, Emma said calmly. Lisa wasn't just handling language, she was a liaison. She managed tone, expectation, etiquette. She had their trust. Max leaned back in his chair, a smug confidence curling in the corner of his mouth. "You're overestimating her," he said flatly. Lisa was organized, sure, but not irreplaceable. Let's keep our heads here. We don't need to build mythology around one employee. Emma didn't back down. "Max, it's not mythology. It's operational reality. Malta wasn't just a checkbox project to her. It was a relationship. She spent months building rapport, customizing every step." Max waved a dismissive hand. "Everyone in Malta speaks English. It's basically their second language. And if we need local support, we'll find a contractor. There are probably 100 freelancers in Valletta who can handle what she did." There was a silence. Not the polite kind. The stunned kind. Jared shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, Max, it's not just about literal translation. Lisa could anticipate what they were trying to say, even when they didn't say it. She knew what mattered to them. That's not something you pick up off Fiverr." Max's jaw tightened. "We're moving forward. I've already shortened the Malta launch timeline. This project doesn't need to be sentimental. It needs to be strategic. If they need to adapt, they will. We'll manage." Emma looked down, visibly biting her tongue. Others exchanged glances. A few opened their mouths and closed them again. No one wanted to push too far. But the truth sat between them, unspoken and growing heavier by the hour. Lisa hadn't just translated documents. She translated people. And without her, they were speaking to Malta in a language that sounded right, but felt wrong. The signs were subtle at first. An unanswered email. A meeting pushed back without explanation. A file returned with vague notes from the Maltese legal team. Nothing overt. Nothing that screamed failure. Just enough to signal something was off. Culture, after all, rarely announces its departure. It just leaves. And in the quiet corners of Harkwell's polished hallways, where ambition buzzed louder than empathy, the first signs of something unraveling began to show. It all came to a head the day the executives flew to Malta. Max led the delegation, accompanied by 2 senior VPs and the company's most important boss, Mr. Hallberg, the chairman of the board. This was supposed to be a triumphant trip. Final contracts were to be signed, photo ops scheduled, and smiles exchanged with Maltese partners who had been waiting months for this moment. As their private shuttle rolled across the sun-drenched hills of Malta, Hallberg turned to Max and asked, "Where's Lisa? I assumed she'd be joining us for this." Max didn't flinch. "Lisa?" he said casually, as if her name meant little. "She left, said she wanted to move on. It was her decision." Hallberg raised an eyebrow. "She was integral to this project, wasn't she?" Max offered a tight-lipped smile. "We've got it under control. Everyone speaks English nowadays. If needed, I'm sure we'll find someone local." No one pushed further. Not yet. But the moment they stepped into the grand hall of the Maltese Business Alliance, it was clear something was wrong. The room was filled with elegantly dressed professionals. Banners displaying Harkwell's logo hung beside the Maltese flag. The hosts greeted them warmly, with formality, enthusiasm, and rapid, fluent Maltese. Max smiled nervously, nodded, and said, "Thank you. We're, happy to be here." The hosts responded in more Maltese. No English. Hallberg turned to Max. "What are they saying?" Max's smile wavered. He looked around. No one on their team understood a word. One of the hosts gestured toward the presentation materials, explaining something about the agenda, but no one caught it. Not a word. "Didn't we have someone who spoke Maltese?" the VP muttered. "They were expecting someone," another added. A secretary pulled Max aside. "There's no translator here. They thought your company was bringing one." Panic settled in. They scrambled. Hotel staff couldn't help. A local contact was unavailable. A freelancer they tried calling was booked for the week. Max paced. The board member glared. "They don't understand us," Max muttered. "They were relying on your translator," Hallberg said quietly, "and you let her walk out the door." For the first time, Max looked shaken. He pulled out his phone, typed desperately, "Lisa, can you talk? We're in Malta. We need your help. I was home, calm and far from the chaos. When the message came through, I watched it light up my screen. Then came the call. I let it ring. And then Emma called. "Lisa," she said, breathless. "Please. They don't speak English. The meeting's falling apart. We need you." I sighed, then calmly answered, "Put me on speaker." In the hours that followed, I became their lifeline. I translated, mediated, explained. I repaired what Max's pride had nearly broken. And when the meeting ended, Malta smiled. I was ready. I'd been ready the moment I walked out of that office. Not bitterly, not out of revenge, but with the calm certainty of someone who had poured months of her life into a project, who knew its every detail, its rhythm, its pulse. I lived for this work. I knew the names, the customs, the nuances. I knew the island's pace, its values, its voice. So when Emma called, breathless, telling me the meeting was unraveling, I was already pulling up the shared documents. I had a notebook ready, reminders scrawled in the margins about our partner's preferred phrases, polite transitions, and cultural red lines not to cross. Because I knew this would happen. And in some way, I had been waiting for it. I guided them through the meeting like a seasoned pilot in a storm, translating every exchange with warmth and confidence, smoothing over Max's awkward silences, reshaping blunt questions into respectful conversation. I could hear the tension easing through the line as the Maltese partners began to nod, smile, respond. But I also heard the hesitation. They weren't pleased. Not entirely. The delay in communication, the absence of the person they had grown to trust, it had bruised the relationship. There was a pause in their voices, a tightness behind their words that hadn't been there before. I translated what they said, but I also heard what they didn't say. They felt disrespected. They had expected a partner who took them seriously, not a CEO who underestimated them, not a company that assumed Google Translate could replace a human connection. Still, I did what I could. I softened their disappointment, realigned the tone, expressed the company's apologies without making it sound like desperation. And by the end of the call, they were cooperative again. The meeting didn't fall apart, but it didn't fly either. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long moment. My tea had gone cold. My notes were marked with last-minute phrases I had used to recover Max's fumbled attempts. He had been silent through most of it. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't on the call. It was in a single, brief message sent an hour later. "Thank you. We couldn't have done it without you." I stared at it, unreadable. It wasn't an apology. Not really. It was an admission, a quiet, reluctant recognition. But I didn't respond. Not yet. Because what happened next, that would determine everything. Max had gambled the company's future on the assumption that I was replaceable. Now, the question wasn't whether he knew he was wrong. It was whether he was brave enough to say it out loud, and whether I would care by the time he did. When the team returned from Malta, the mood in the office was different. The usual clamor of keyboards and hushed hallway chats was replaced by a strained silence. People walked slower, looked over shoulders. No one dared to ask questions aloud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. What happened in Malta? The answer arrived 2 hours after Max stepped back into the building. Mr. Hallberg called him into his office. No assistance, no agenda, just the heavy quiet of a closed door and the weight of consequence. Inside, Hallberg stood at the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn as Max entered. "Sit." Max obeyed, but his usual bravado was missing. He looked tired, smaller. "I trusted you," Hallberg said, still facing the skyline. "You told me everything was under control." "It was a misunderstanding," Max began. "Lisa chose to leave." Hallberg turned then, slowly. His expression wasn't angry. It was worse. It was disappointed. "She chose to leave," he repeated. "After you undermined her, after you dismissed her work, her value, after you replaced her with nothing. That's not a misunderstanding, Max. That's negligence." Max opened his mouth, but Hallberg raised a hand. "You fired the one person who was essential to our expansion. You humiliated her in front of staff. You gambled a 6-month international launch on ego, and we were lucky, that she was professional enough to step in and fix it, from her living room." There was a long pause. You nearly cost us the Malta partnership, Hallberg continued. We spent millions on this project. We built trust. We made promises. You almost unraveled all of it. Max was silent. For once, he had nothing to say. Hallberg moved behind his desk and sat down. He looked at Max for a long moment, then slid a slim white envelope across the table. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Max stared at it, frozen. We'll handle your exit quietly, Hallberg said. You'll sign the NDA and you'll leave today. Max stood slowly, face pale. He picked up the envelope, hesitated as if to speak, then thought better of it. He walked out without another word. The office buzzed with the kind of subdued energy that only came when justice had been served. And in a quiet cafe a few blocks away, I sipped my coffee, refreshed my inbox, and waited. Because I knew what would come next. The next morning, my inbox was no longer quiet. There it was, an email from Mr. Hallberg himself. The subject line read, "Let's talk." I sat for a moment, rereading the subject line again and again. I knew it was coming, but even then, I let myself feel the weight of it. This wasn't just a meeting request. It was an opening, a chance to reclaim what I had built, and maybe more. We met in a modest corner office, not his usual sleek conference room or executive suite. Just 2 chairs, a table, and a view of the city's morning haze. There was something deliberate about the setting, humble, honest, no distractions. Hallberg rose to shake my hand, and for the first time, his grip felt less like a power move and more like a gesture of respect. Lisa, he began, his voice low and measured, I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you a proper thank you. I stayed quiet, letting him speak. You didn't just save a meeting, he said. You saved our reputation. You salvaged a relationship that took months to cultivate. Max's decisions nearly cost us everything, and we've corrected that. But now I want to correct another mistake. He opened a folder he'd placed on the table and slid it across to me. Inside were freshly printed documents, an offer for me to return. But it wasn't a return to the same desk or title. It was a promotion. Director of Cultural Strategy. I blinked, staring at the bold letters on the page. The title wasn't just ceremonial. It came with a team, a budget, and full leadership over international partnerships. You built this bridge, Hallberg said. You saw it through when others didn't even see the water. We want you to lead, not just Malta, all of it. My heart pounded. Not from surprise, but from the validation. This wasn't a handout. It was recognition. Earned. Deserved. I accept, I said, my voice steady. Not because I needed revenge. Not because I wanted a title. But because this had always been mine. The Malta expansion, the relationships, the nuance. It was my work. And now I had the authority to do it justice. Within a week, I was back. My desk had been moved to the corner office near the executive wing, my name etched in glass, my new team already in formation. Emma greeted me with a warm hug, and the look in the staff's eyes had changed, from sympathy to pride. On the first video call with Malta, I introduced myself once again. This time, not as a coordinator, but as the leader. I spoke in fluent Maltese, thanking them for their patience, acknowledging the confusion, and reaffirming our partnership. Their faces lit up, not just with relief, but with trust. Repaired, renewed. We signed the final contracts that month. There were handshakes in Valletta, champagne in the boardroom, and a glowing press release that spoke of international harmony and forward vision. But those were just optics. What mattered most was this. I had been underestimated, pushed aside, disregarded, and yet I had returned, not begging, not broken, but leading. Because sometimes being underestimated isn't the end of your story. Sometimes it's just the prologue. And this was my beginning, and they would never forget my name again.